Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Yongki and I am a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to talk about E-2 visa options for low investment amounts and high-risk E-2 visa cases. And we are very lucky to have our firm's managing partner, Kelly Weiner, as the speaker for this webinar. I will be covering the beginning parts of our presentation, and Kelly will take over the rest. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer services in wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, and any types of employment-based or family-based green card cases. That said, we are especially well known for our work with the E2 visas. We have built a strong reputation in the E2 visa world, and we have processed hundreds and hundreds of E2 visa cases. Many of them were higher risk cases and have worked with the US consular offices all over the world. One of the particular reasons for this, our firm's focusing on E2 visa is that our firm was established on an E2 visa by our firm's founder, Ian Scott himself. And that's why we know a lot about E2 visa's world. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools. A copy of a PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, a link where you can download the guides with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for additional webinars, a link to webinar recording on YouTube. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration related videos. And lastly, a link where you can sign up private consultation with our team. Finally, for any questions, please type them into chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of presentation. And with that, let's get started. So E2 visa is basically based on a treaty agreement between United States and foreign country. And currently, United States have signed the agreement with more than 80 countries. The list of E2 countries occasionally change, not often, like every few years. A few countries would be added or fall off from the list. So you should check the official E2 country list before you actually submit your E2 visa application. But keep in mind that you do not need to be born from this treaty country. You just need to hold a passport from one of these treaty countries. So for example, let's say you were born in India, which is not a treaty country with the United States, but later immigrant to the Canada and have a Canada passport right now, then you are eligible for the E2 visa. And you must own at least 50%, half of the ownership in the E2 company. The corporation type does not matter, but we usually recommend LLC or C Corp because these are the types giving you very simple and clear supporting document when you organize the supporting document for the E2 visa application. You could have a business partner. For example, if you are Canadian and your business partner who owns the other half of a company has an Italian passport, then your business partner can also apply for the E2 visa. But you have to make sure that you have at least 50% ownership. And this requirement continues when you renew your E2 visa later on. So you should consult with an immigration attorney, a specialist, whenever there is any change of ownership structure in your E2 business. The next requirement is that you must make a substantial investment. Then what is substantial investment? Well, we'll talk about it in more details later, but generally speaking, it means sufficient amount to make the E2 business fully operational. For example, if your business is a consulting company, then obviously the required funds to establish the business is less than a manufacturing facility. However, can you claim that your consulting company only needs $5,000 to make it fully operational? In reality, maybe, but it's not going to work in your E2 visa applications. To meet the standard of consular officers and satisfy their review standards, we generally recommend to invest minimum $50,000 regardless of your business types. I'm sure Kelly will address more about this issue in details later on. For now, let's go over with each bullet point here. The fund must be at risk. It means the wire transferred investment fund must be used and spent. For example, you transferred $100,000 to your E2 business corporate account. Then you need to spend money, let's say, to obtain the lease agreement, to buy like a necessary office equipment, or to obtain professional accounting or marketing services. You will need to show that you have spent sufficient amount out of $100,000 in your E2 visa application. The next one is source of funds should be satisfied. Any legit source can be used, but please keep in mind that government wants to see very clear fund flows from the documentation. So you should try very hard to keep it simple and easy for the government officers to understand that how the fund was originated and came to E2 business corporate account. How much is enough? Again, we'll talk about more detail in next slide, but generally speaking, we recommend you invest and spend at least $50,000. Typical E2 expenditures. So this bullet point is to show you how you should spend your investment for the purpose of your E2 visa application. You do not want to spend several $100s for a beautiful dinner with a potential business partner and claim it as a business expense. In real life, yes, you could claim it for the company tax deduction purpose, but such is not highly recommended for your E2 visa case. So keep in mind that inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, office warehouse rent, marketing, business entity setup. These are the most preferred expenses for your E2 visa application. Next slide. So next requirement, business cannot be marginal. This is the whole point that why US government is giving out E2 visas to foreign nationals. The E2 business is supposed to create jobs and contribute to local economy in the United States. So if the E2 business is barely making incomes just to cover E2 investor and his family members' living costs, obviously government would not like it. So therefore, it is very important that your E2 business should create enough incomes to hire local US employees. You could even hire an employee before you apply E2 visa application. And actually, such would actually strengthen your E2 visa case. So if you think your investment is low, then it may be good strategy to hire a US employee before the visa application. Business must be real and operating. What it means is that when you arrive at United States with a valid E2 visa, your business must be able to start operating pretty much immediately. To prove this element is satisfied, you will usually need to submit a signed commercial lease agreement, like a business entity has been fully established and registered with the state government, and company website is created and up and running, and maybe contracts with the potential customers. And if it is some kind of business that requires a license, then you should be already ready with the license. The next, you will solely develop and direct the E2 enterprise. It simply means you are coming to United States only for your E2 business. Your E2 business is basically your full-time job. So you should not, like, for example, driving a Uber as a side hustle or just become a passive shareholder of E2 business. You should be actively participating in the E2 business's daily operations. But just one practical tip about this element is that when you submit your application to USCIS, they are a little concerned to see if you are actually performing the services without any employees, because such would be direct competition against the local labor market. So if you have been running your E2 business too long without any employees, then it is kind of red flag sign. So you should consult with an immigration attorney to carefully develop your application. The next, you have intent to return to home country upon expiration of a E2 visa. So basically, E2 visa is not a green card and does not automatically lead to a green card, unlike United Kingdoms, where if you have a 5 years of visa, you might get a green card later on. It only allows to enter United States for temporary period to develop and run your E2 business. But it does not mean that you cannot renew your E2 visa and obtain US permanent residency. You could renew it, and eventually you could go after US green card. But you should carefully design the case direction with an immigration attorney or specialist for the green card, because in each case they have a different situations. The next one is a few options for the starting point. You could start a business or buy an existing business, or you can sign into a franchise agreement. If we are considering to buy an existing business, please consider that business already has a good number of employees, because again, having existing employees before the visa application submission is really good plus point. Also, you could arrange escrow consideration in the business transaction. This is one exception to the requirement where I said you should have spent enough money before applying for the E2 visa. The contract language in this case will say that the transaction money, the purchase money, will be held in the escrow account and will be released upon the approval of E2 visa application, which has been very acceptable way for the E2 visa applications. So how long is E2 visa valid? Well, it depends on the treaty agreement between the United States and the foreign country. Well, it could be very short, like 3 months or 5 years. Then does it mean I could run my business only 3 months if visa is only valid because visa is only 3 months? Answer is no. Regardless of the visa validity duration on your passport, you will typically get 2 years of E2 status when you come to United States. So you could run your business for 2 years, but it means once you go out from the United States, you have to reapply and renew your E2 visa again. How much investment is enough? The regulation do not specifically state a minimum investment amount. As you know, EB5 requires a minimum investment, like $800,000, but E2 does not have a such requirement. This means you could get approval even with $50,000 depending on type of business. And more importantly, you need to show that amount is enough to make the business fully operational and that it looks reasonable to the government officer. That is why we usually recommend investing at least $50,000 to meet the government officer's review standards. Sometimes government applies what is called a proportionality test. This usually comes up in very large investment like $1 million, pharmaceutical factory situation. In that case, you may not need to spend 100% before you apply. But since we are talking about smaller and riskier investment situation today, I would generally say the proportional test does not apply. And it is much better if you spend 100% of investment fund before you submit application if you believe that your case is a low investment amount case. If you are buying a business, you may wonder what counts as a substantial amount. Usually, it is the fair market value. To find out whether you are paying fair market value amount or not, you may hire a business appraiser or get an evaluation report if you need to. So what are some strategies to deal with the low investment amount? If your E2 case is weak because your investment amount is small and in that case, you may want to strengthen other aspects of your case. One of the most recommended strategy is hiring a US worker before you submit the application. And that's probably one of the best steps you can take. Another thing you could do is show that your E2 business is already has demand from the potential client and potential business partners in the United States. For example, you submit a signed contract or a MOU or letter of intent from those potential clients or business partners could be very useful to persuade government officers that your business has a very strong potential. You can also get a letter from a local chamber of commerce where your business will be located. Such letter can say that your E2 business will create jobs and provide value to the community. This kind of support can make a huge difference in your low investment cases. And as you may know, a business plan is one of the requirement document, and a strong plan showing your marketing and competitive strategies, your strong projected revenues, how many employees you are planning to hire over the next 5 years. Those kind of well-organized business plan could definitely help your case as well. That is why when our firm prepares one, it is usually more than 30 pages and it is designed to strengthen case and meet the officer's standard. A CPA, a certified public accountant's letter can be also used. This type of letter basically says that accountant reviewed the financials of your company and based on their experience, the investment amount is sufficient to operate the proposed E2 business. You could be more creative to strengthen the low investment case, but these are the typical ways we recommend. With that in mind, let me turn it over Kelly, who will guide you through the next part of our presentation, and she will cover how to wisely spend the money and improve your E2 visa application. So please stay tuned.
Thank you, Yongki. Perfect. So we're going to turn now to talk about some common E2 expenditures. Very common question from people is what can I spend money on? And the answer is that it will depend on the type of business you're starting, right? So if you're starting up a restaurant, for example, or a coffee shop, there's going to be some very specific things that you need to buy. However, because we deal with so many kind of service-based businesses where there's some more questions about what to buy, there are some things that every business will need. And this list kind of goes over, kind of common expenses that are considered strong expenses by the officers reviewing the case. So things like most businesses will need some type of website. So anything you pay to get that set up, equipment, computers, printers, scanners, anything that, you have for yourself or for your employees, inventory, which can be shipped from another country, furniture, but only furniture for business purposes. So they're very sensitive to, if somebody says, well, I'm going to have a home office and I'm going to work at my dining room table. So I've purchased a dining room table set, that's not going to work. But if you have, specific furniture that you've purchased for your office or, your type of business requires a television or something like that, that can be included. Trademark or IP purchase or development can be included if there's a objective valuation for it. Any employee payroll or independent contractor payments. This would include only what you've actually paid at the time that you submit your application. So, for example, if you hire an employee for $50,000 a year, you can't include the whole 50,000, but if you've paid them for 2 months of work, that could be included in your investment. Legal fees, both related to immigration and also maybe corporate transaction fees. The immigration fees are kind of weaker than, other types of more professional legal fees, but can also be included. Office lease, so, sometimes you can prepay for rent as well. This is only for, again, for a commercial office space. So similar to the furniture, if you're going to have a home office, you cannot include your mortgage or your rent for your residential space, even if you're going to use it as a home office. Software, advertising, office supplies. So these are just some ideas of what most businesses will need at a minimum. And then you would also need to spend over and above this, again, if you have the type of business that requires something specific, like you need a warehouse for your business or you need, certain equipment because of the type of business you're starting, or if you have a photography business. So again, you want to be thinking about what do I need to spend, to get this particular type of business up and running. All right, let's talk a little bit about some weak expenditures. So these are things that we kind of almost never recommend including. The reason being that the benefit you get from the higher investment amount kind of goes away because the officer views these as weak expenses and may feel that you're kind of reaching or stretching and may look at your other expenses, with more scrutiny if they feel you're trying to include things like this. So kind of travel, anything you pay for flights. These are generally not strong expenditures. If there's a very specific business conference that's very relevant, you could consider including it, but it's usually not a strong expense and not good to include. Similarly, a car or a vehicle. Now, this is one that, depending on your type of business, this may be strong. So, for example, if you're opening a food truck business or you have a mobile pet grooming business, these are both examples of businesses we've done. Obviously, you would need a vehicle for that. If you have a construction company, you may have a good argument that you need a vehicle for that. Those are examples of when a car or a vehicle might be a good expense for the E2. It would not be a good expense if, for example, you're opening a consulting company and you say, well, I'm going to need to have a car in the United States. I'll use it kind of personally and then also to drive to work. That's not going to be an example of a good E2 expense at that point. So a car, could be good, but for many types of businesses, it really won't be. You have to make that argument that it's really a commercial vehicle being used for work purposes. So similarly, kind of to flights, hotel accommodations, meals, transportation, entertainment, none of these are strong expenditures. They're not viewed favorably by the officers. Um, And then also expenses paid to related parties. And so what we mean there is, let's say that you have a company in Germany that you own, and it develops websites. And now you have a company in the United States, your E-2 company, and you want your US company to pay your German company to develop the website. So it's not prohibited, but it's not a very strong expense because, if the officer becomes aware, well, you own this company, so it doesn't feel like you've put any money at risk. You've really just shifted your money from one company you own to another company you own. Similarly, if it's a company your spouse owns, that's a similar type of situation where if it were to come to light, it's just not viewed as a very strong expense. So again, not prohibited, but is not going to be the strongest way to spend the money for your case. All right, let's talk about some specific challenges and tips for consulting businesses. So we do a lot of consulting businesses, and a major challenge that we have here for our clients is that theoretically a very low investment or sometimes no investment is needed to start this consulting business. It's very common that we have clients contact us and say, I have my network, I have my knowledge, I own a laptop, I can put together a bare bones website, I don't need to spend any money. And, while that is true, if you're just looking at it as an entrepreneur, for the visa, there is a requirement that you invest a substantial amount and that you put that money at risk and irrevocably commit it to the business enterprise. So, what we recommend here is that, a few different things. So, one is you can get kind of some market research, some articles to show here's how much it costs to get these types of businesses up and running. And then you want to point out that you've spent far in excess of that amount. You also, though, need to just consider spending money, even though it may not be necessary at this particular moment. And this can be one of the most challenging things about the E-2 sometimes for entrepreneurs, because obviously they want to spend as little as possible. That being said, in order to get the visa, you do have to spend money. So what we recommend is that you kind of look forward a couple years, look at your, expenses you think you would incur, and then maybe try to bring some of those expenses, forward to where you are and spend the money now. So, for example, for office space, see if you can prepay for 6 months or 12 months. For equipment, maybe you're planning to hire an administrative assistant in the end of year one or year two. Maybe you purchase a laptop and equipment for that employee now. Maybe you make a larger investment in marketing than you think you really need to at the start. So instead of paying for a very bare bones website, you really kind of work with someone to get a more comprehensive website set up, which you were going to do anyway, but you're going to do it sooner. Hire employees. So hiring US employees is great for your case, both from the perspective of spending the money, and getting your investment amount higher, and then also from proving that you meet the marginality requirement and that you're going to hire workers in the United States. Also, anything that you pay that you spend to onboard those employees can be included. So let's say you have to get a payroll provider, you have to get insurance. All those are really strong expenditures, for the E-2. And then you also just want to make sure that you're spending in a large number of categories. So it doesn't look good, for example, to say, hey, I spent $40,000 on a website and I bought some pens. And, that's my investment. I've spent a lot. That doesn't really work. Again, you need to be thinking holistically about making the argument that you've spent everything necessary to get this particular type of business up and running. So for a consulting company, they want to know, okay, I have a professional commercial office space. I've gotten all the equipment I need. I have the software. I have, a marketing plan, and I paid money for that. I have employees if I need them. So you do want to be thinking strategically. We don't want people kind of throwing their money away. Um, but the reality of it is that you will need to spend the money, to get the E-2. And so that is something that you have to work with and figure out how can I spend this money strategically to get me kind of the best, return on that. All right, let's move to talk about some real estate investments. So, real estate for E-2 can be challenging as there is kind of a presumption sometimes by the part of the consular officer that it is a passive investment. So even on some consular websites in the FAQs, they will say, purchasing a property and putting it in an LLC does not qualify. And the reason why they have that on there is that people will do this, right? So they'll purchase a couple properties, maybe they're just collecting rental income, and this isn't going to be considered kind of real and operating enough to get an E-2 visa. So that's really your challenge if you want to go the real estate route is demonstrating that you have a real and operating enterprise that's going to have revenue, it's going to hire employees and kind of be able to sustain that as opposed to just kind of collecting rental income. So some potential ideas here that have worked for prior clients, things like a real estate brokerage firm, a property management company. So if you have properties and you want to manage them, and then maybe you manage other properties from other property owners, that can work. Real estate renovation or construction companies, that can work. House flipping, but generally only on a very large scale. So they are sensitive to this as well. Like if you just have purchased one property and you want to flip that property, that's often not going to be kind of enough activity to justify an E2. But let's say, for example, we had a client who had a portfolio of 30 to 40 homes they were working on. So this level of investment would work for the E2. That being said, your investment amount is obviously going to be quite high, right? Because you have a lot of expenses associated with the house flipping. For people that want to do house flipping on a smaller scale, and are not able to kind of have that, be the main thing, you may want to investigate kind of some type of, hybrid company where maybe you have property management services and then a secondary service is house flipping, or you do renovation or construction and a secondary service is house flipping. And that's sometimes how you can accommodate kind of what you want to do. But again, you would need to have that, that activity within the company to show that you're going to be able to actually sustain it, have revenue, have employees. You also want to make sure that you are, understanding what are the licensing requirements, because for these types of businesses, there's often kind of state-specific licensing. For example, if you're going to be in construction, if you're going to be a broker, you may need licenses. Sometimes you can't even get those licenses until you have a social security number, so you may need to partner with kind of a local company. So we have walked many clients through these types of concerns and, are happy to discuss it in consultations when people have, specific questions. All right, let's look at equity trading companies. So these have a lot of the same kind of risks as the real estate. So again, the concern the officer might have is, are you just taking a stock portfolio and putting it in the name of an LLC and doing day trading or personal investing? Are you really going to be, developing a business that's going to have clients, have employees? Your employees or your clients should generally go beyond friends and family. There has to be enough activity in this business. And you also have to show again that you have the proper licenses. So this is another industry that's highly regulated. Often there will be kind of multiple entities, especially if you're setting up kind of a hedge fund or something. So you have to, be aware of how to structure it to make sure that you will have an entity that will qualify for the E2. So we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So E2 denials. So what are some reasons for E2 denials? So one would be low investment amount. We've talked about some strategies today for dealing with low investment amounts. That being said, some investment amounts are just too low. So we had a client who invested, $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. That just was not enough. It's too low. The officer said, get a B1 visa, explore your investment a little bit more, kind of put more money at risk and come back. And, that person then came to our firm and we were able to advise them. They ended up spending about 50,000. The remaining 50,000 was in the business bank account and they ultimately were approved for the E2. Nature of the business is another one. So we've talked here today, there are some businesses that will have more scrutiny on them than other types of businesses. So like real estate, equity trading, consulting, these all have kind of specific concerns the officer might have. And so if you do have that type of case, it's really important that you have a very strong, E2 application kind of in all elements to prove that you really meet the requirements. Filing location and venue is also very important. So ultimately, even though the law is the same, there are kind of different standards that consulates will apply. For example, certain consulates are used to seeing large multinational companies that send over dozens or hundreds of employees. These types of consulates may be less friendly to kind of the small, single owner investor who's investing $80,000 because they're used to seeing millions of dollars of investment. And then there's also other venues that are more used to that. So for example, Toronto, London, these are often kind of good, good consulates for kind of smaller business owners. Also, if you apply for a change of status with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, there can be some challenges there, but one benefit is they are more open to lower investment amounts. The next two reasons for denial are kind of related. So, for example, if you have run a business in your home country for many years and you never hired anyone, they may not believe your business plan that says you plan to hire people in the US. If you have that type of case, you really may want to hire somebody before you file because the history shows that you have not hired someone. So they may not believe kind of your projections. And this relates to the other bullet point, which is just concern over whether the business will create jobs for U.S. workers. So this is a very important requirement of the E-2. The business has to be able to support more than just the investor and their family. You do not have to have hired anybody before you apply, but you do have to show that you have a realistic financial plan that will allow you to hire people over a 5-year time scale. You also could have, oh, sorry. You also, just two more. You also could have issues with the adjudicating officer. So consular officers are human beings. They have good days and bad days. They have different levels of training, and they have different opinions and kind of supervisors, who are telling them, this is, it should be this, it should be that. If you really feel that you got kind of an officer that didn't know what they were doing or they were extremely unfair, when you reapply, most consulates will try to give you a different consular officer. It's not guaranteed, but it is something to consider if you are, going to reapply, that often you will get to speak to a different officer. Another reason might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So, for example, sometimes people will file on their own, or maybe with attorneys who aren't as familiar, with immigration. Perhaps you purchased a company, but the entire thing is secured by a loan. Secured by the E-2 company, so at that point, no money has been placed at risk. Or maybe a treaty country national doesn't own, 50% of the company. So in those cases, if you didn't meet the requirements, you would kind of need to, reassess the application, see if you can make it compliant for the E-2, and then reapply. Okay, let's talk about some adjudication trends. So approval rates for E-2s, are and have continued to be generally quite high. Government posted approval rates are generally between 80 to 90%. Our approval rate is 98%, although past results do not predict future outcomes. No one can ever guarantee that your visa will be approved. Timelines. So London right now is taking about 80 to 90 business days to review your E-2 case, and then maybe a few weeks to schedule an appointment after that. Toronto, they are generally reviewing cases within about 10 to 20 business days. However, then appointments are often not available for a couple months. This is kind of a recent change. Previously, Toronto usually had appointments maybe within a couple of weeks, but there have been a lot of changes to the consulates this year that has required the consulate to interview more people than they normally would. And what we are seeing is kind of more delays in appointment availability. Kind of generally discussing timelines, every consulate is their own universe. So if you are going to apply at a specific consulate, you do want to check, do they have any publicly listed processing times? Some do, some don't. Even if they are publicly listed, they're not a guarantee. So when you're thinking about your E-2 and processing times, again, you always want to be thinking about it kind of in months, not weeks, because that is really the time frame at most, kind of most consular posts. Moving to talk about USCIS versus the consulate. So for the E-2, you have two options about where you will apply. One could be with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for a change of status. This would only be available if you were in the United States in a valid status that allows you to change status. So, for example, if you were in the U.S., on a B-1 business visitor visa, and you decided, hey, I'd rather just apply here than go back to my home country to get the E-2 visa stamp, that would be an option for you. If you had entered on ESTA, that would not be an option because ESTA doesn't allow that change of status. Or let's say you were on an H-1B, and you're interested in kind of starting your own company. That would be another scenario where a change of status might be available to you. With a USCIS filing, that change of status, what you get is a 2-year approval notice that allows you to stay in the United States and run the company. A benefit of this type of filing is that you can pay premium processing fees to the government to get a response within 15 business days. This can be an approval, denial, or request for evidence. Another benefit is that, as I mentioned previously, USCIS is a bit more friendly towards lower investment amounts if it makes sense for the type of business. There are some downsides, though. So with the change of status, you're not going to get a visa stamp that allows you to travel internationally. So let's say you get a 2-year approval and 1 year in, you have to travel. There's some emergency back home. Once you travel outside the United States, you cannot re-enter on the basis of the approval notice. You would have to go to a consulate, submit a brand new E-2 visa application, and get a visa stamp to come back in. Additionally, the consulate does not have to rely on the USCIS approval. So there are some visa types where once you get the USCIS approval, it's a bit more of an easy process at the consulate. They're not re-adjudicating your case; they're just checking admissibility. That's not the case for the E-2. With the E-2, they do not have to rely on the USCIS approval at all. They can completely disregard it, and they will just look at your case as a brand new case. The other downside with USCIS is that they take a very, very strict view of the source and trail of funds. So if you have a very complex source and trail of funds, the money came from a lot of different places, it's hard to prove how it was accumulated. That's going to be much more difficult with USCIS than at a consulate, where they tend to take a much more holistic view of the source and trail of funds. So moving to kind of talk about consular E-2 filings. So the benefit of a consular filing is you're going to get an E-2 visa stamp in your passport that allows you to travel internationally. For many people, this is a huge benefit, especially for countries where you can receive, a multi-year, multi-entry visa. Many countries can receive 4 years, up to 5 years on the E-2. And every time you enter, you're given 2 years in E-2 status. So let's say you enter in year 4 of your visa validity, you could be given another 2 years. So sometimes if your business maybe is in a patch where it's not doing so well, having that visa, that 5-year visa is going to give you kind of a longer runway before you have to go back for renewal. Whereas with an E-2 change of status, 2 years in, you'll have to submit more paperwork if you want to continue to run the business. Consulates, again, also tend to take a bit more of a holistic view of the source and trail of funds. Many of them have page limits. So you're submitting more of a snapshot of the investment as opposed to kind of a full audit trail that USCIS would require. So moving to kind of post-specific considerations. I know I mentioned previously, consulates are even though the law is the same, consulates operate differently. They have different timelines, they have different things that they want to see. And you do need to follow those instructions closely, as often, they will kind of send it back to you. For example, in Toronto, there's a 50-page limit. If you go over that, they will send it back to you and say, please comply with our procedures, and we'll let you know if we need more documents. So you do need to pay close attention to those, to make sure that you get your application submitted. There's also consular preferences. So again, some consulates, prefer higher dollar value, investments. Sometimes they go through trends where they, are focusing on particular things. So you want to discuss with your attorney to see, kind of what is happening at that particular consulate at this point in time. Unfortunately, due to kind of policy changes this year, people can no longer really as easily apply in other countries. You have to apply basically in the country that you have a passport from or that you are currently resident in. Whereas previously, for example, if you were in the United States, Toronto often would allow third country nationals to apply there, and Toronto is a quite good, reasonable E-2 consulate. That unfortunately, for now at least, is no longer the case. So CPA certification of business plans. So you want to just be aware of this. There are some consulates that do require you have a CPA certify your business plan. Mexico and Singapore come to mind, but these are things, requirements that can change. So you always need to check the consular instructions. Our firm does offer the service of assisting clients with drafting their business plans, and we do also have a CPA on staff who can, help with that certification as well. Let's turn to some issues in complex areas, for E2s and some common questions that come up. So one is, do I have to hire employees before I apply for an E2? And the answer is no. There's nothing in the law or regulations that requires this. That being said, there are times when certain consulates will kind of go through phases where I've heard many clients say, "Oh, an officer said I had to have an employee." Again, like this is not a requirement. We've had, hundreds of cases, if not more, approved without any employees being hired. But if you do get an officer or there is a trend at a consulate where they're really focusing on this, it can be beneficial to try to hire somebody before you apply, for marginality, for real and operating requirements, and also that anything you pay to them, you can include in your investments. There's kind of multiple benefits if you are able to do it. Uh, Complicated source and trail of funds. So if you're applying with USCIS, having a complex source and trail of funds will make your case much more difficult. They won't, even if it's, well, it was a sale of a company 25 years ago, and then the money went here, and then the money went there. They want to see the entire trail if that is the source. So you do have to kind of be mindful about which source, you're choosing for the E2. Loans and gifts are permitted as sources of funds. For the loans, they have to be personal loans that are either unsecured or secured by your personal property as the investor. They cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 business. This comes up sometimes in seller financing situations where someone is purchasing a business and they want to put down 50% and have 50%, seller financing. This often will not work because the seller financing, the asset um, that's being secured is the assets of the E2 company. Gifts can work for the E2. That being said, the gift giver has to be comfortable providing their financial documentation. So you cannot just provide a gift letter. Let's say your mother is gifting you some money, from her sale of her condo. She has to be willing to provide, the proof that she sold the condo, the proof she received the money from that sale. So gifts, can be very effective as long as the gift giver is willing to provide their financial documentation. Uh, so E2 visas for two investors, is this possible? Yes, this is possible. The ownership has to be 50-50 and each investor has to qualify. So each investor has to make their own investment. It's not going to work if one investor is investing 100,000 and one investor invests 5,000. That second investor is going to struggle to show they've invested a substantial amount. Um, Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. So sometimes clients will kind of get a visa and maybe it's a 5-year visa and they think, great, this visa allows me to work in the US. And this visa allows you to work at the company that you represented to the consulate in the line of business that you explained to them. So any changes to ownership, for example, if the treaty country national no longer owns 50%, even if you have a 5-year visa, if you own now 20% of the company and your US citizen partner owns 80%, this company is no longer an E2 company and you are not maintaining your status anymore. Similarly, any major changes to the type of business can be problematic for maintaining your status. So let's say that you had that property management company and you said, I also am going to do house flipping. And then over time, house flipping becomes a bigger part of the business. This is not a problem. What would be a problem is, you shut down your wedding photography business and you open up a restaurant. If you want to make a change that's that substantial and you have not contemplated it in your initial business plan, you need to, get an approval either from USCIS or from the consulate before you start that new line of business. Um, Family business purchases. This is something that, there's going to be more scrutiny on this. If you do want to do this, you just want to make sure that it's clear the amount that you are investing is the fair market value for the business that you're buying. So if it's an extremely successful business and the financials show that, and you're paying a very low amount for a majority share in the company, and the owner is your brother, they may not believe that this is really the fair market value or that you've really invested a substantial amount. So if you are in that situation, you just want to make sure that you have a proper evaluation by an objective third party that explains, yes, this is the fair market value, for this type of business. Um, Turning to the impact of the current administration, so there have been many executive orders issued in relation to immigration, none that kind of specifically target the E-2 program, but everyone should know that there's kind of enhanced vetting for all visa types. They're looking more closely at, everyone's profiles, so always something to keep in mind. We all, also anticipate just that they will want kind of higher investment amounts, higher employee numbers. These are things that are always going to be, beneficial for your case, because that is the purpose of the E-2 program, is to increase, economic benefit, for the treaty countries and the United States. We also recommend trying to make more of your investments in the United States. So it is not a requirement, you have to invest a substantial amount, but it's not a requirement that you spend that money in the United States. That being said, it's going to look better for your case if you do so. So if you have an option to choose kind of a vendor, abroad or one in the US, it's going to be better for your case to choose one in the US. We also note that E-2 approval rates did not change much from 2016 to 2020. Not to say they couldn't change, at this current, point in time, but we have not seen that yet. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. That was very helpful and informative. With that, let's go ahead and take a look at some questions.
All right. So this first question, about vehicles, how about an RV motorhome with an inbuilt office to visit clients, across the US as a consulting business? This is very creative, and the first time I've heard this particular question, but I will say I think this would not be a good. I think this would not be a good option. I think it would be very risky if you are primarily using it, for your home, like you will actually be living there. And the only reason to have it is, well, I'm also going to be driving to client sites. I think that this likely would be a weaker expense. I think they would view this more like somebody saying, I want to include I have a home office and I want to include like my rent or my residential mortgage. So I would not recommend using that, for the E-2. So I'd like to understand how to structure my investment using an escrow account. While ensuring the invested capital is considered at risk and showing I have at least one employee. Can you explain how these conditions, can be met simultaneously? So when you're doing an escrow arrangement, generally this is available when you are purchasing an existing business. So like it's going to depend on whether it's let's say you have let's say it's an asset purchase. So you have your own LLC and that LLC is going to purchase the assets of another company. You could have an escrow arrangement. That means you're going to have a purchase sale agreement. You're going to sign it. You're going to say all conditions for this sale are satisfied except for the approval of the E-2 visa. Simultaneously, you would have to transfer some other amount of money into your, LLC, and you could hire an employee, to kind of be doing some administrative work for you. So that's one scenario where it could work. If it was a share purchase where you're actually purchasing the equity of another company, it may be that you couldn't have an employee actively working yet. But if you're purchasing an existing business, usually what you want is to be able to say, well, this existing business has employees in it, and I am going to, can keep those employees on once, the E-2 is approved and the escrow is transferred, to the seller. All right, so very subjective, but is 32,000 in license and 15,000 okay? So for these types of very specific questions, these aren't something that we can really answer on the webinar. I would say set up a consultation and we can kind of talk through, kind of these specific types of questions, because they would always be fact specific. So what happens if there is a USCIS denial for a change of status currently in your grace period? So this will depend, if you are still in your grace period when you get the denial, you can kind of depart the United States. If you are out of your grace period and you get the denial, you'll be kind of in a period, there will be some period of kind of unauthorized stay, and then you would also start to accrue unlawful presence if you remain beyond that time. So there could be some implications there, especially because now the government has gotten more aggressive and is sometimes issuing notices to appear, even for employment-based cases in certain circumstances. So definitely important to understand those implications. I would recommend setting up a consultation to discuss that. For the E-2 visa, which route would you recommend? Applying directly at the U.S. consulate or filing a change of status? What are the pros and cons? So we did go over the pros and cons of each kind of with, in this presentation today. If you'd like kind of specific guidance on your particular situation, I would recommend setting up a consultation, and we can always talk through, those approaches. Generally, if you travel internationally a lot, a consular filing is going to be better, especially if you're somebody with a nationality where you could get a multi-entry, multi-year visa. Approval rates for 2025. So 2025, the government doesn't make available the like right now the data that we have that they've made available is up to 2024, but we'll update once we get the new data from USCIS. Do the hires need to be employees or can they be contractors? So it's much better for your case to have employees. It is also possible sometimes to work with contractors depending on the type of business you have, like in construction, where it's very common to have contractors. You may be, if you're paying them huge amounts, you may be able to kind of argue for that. But most companies should also have some W-2 employees, even if only one or two. Would the E-2 work to establish a holding company where the business plan is to buy several businesses within a niche? So this can sometimes work, but it can be complicated because the holding company itself has to have revenue and it has to have employees. So like the holding company cannot just be completely passive. There's different structures that you can put in place for this where you want to actually have multiple companies that you're running, and the holding company is like the management services company. So, definitely would recommend setting up a consultation to discuss if you want to talk about that more. We do have clients that have done that approach. Would Scott Legal be willing to help a 30K investment for a content-led growth marketing agency? Again, please set up a consultation. We have done similar types of cases. 30,000 is extremely low. I've only seen that amount approved really with USCIS, not with the consulates, but it's always going to be fact specific. Buying a 51% in a company that the owner runs it with two employees. How can I prove I will be actively managing the company instead of that the actual owner will step aside? So yeah, I mean, if you're going to be running a company with someone, usually what we recommend is carving out kind of two roles for you, right? So if this person is the CFO, you're the CEO. If you have majority share, it should be clear in the, operating documents or the, corporate documents that you have that control. If I file for a change of status while in the US, can my family apply for E-2 dependent visas from outside without me being present? Technically, this is possible. Practically, there are concerns. Like many consulates are not as familiar with this. So, although you can argue that the law specifically does allow for it, some consulates will make an issue of it. Sometimes they want to re-adjudicate the initial E-2. So, like technically, this is possible. Yes, we have done it, but you can run into issues, particularly depending on which consulate you're going to. Without employees and contractors, won't the officer feel I would be doing most of the work? This is why you have a business plan, because you do have to demonstrate in the business plan how you're going to hire workers. And we usually recommend hiring them if it's USCIS within the first year. If it's a consular, maybe within year two, to show that you will have other people so that you are actually running the company and you have employees doing the operational work. Any whispers about changes in the E-2 in the near future? Not at this moment. None that we are aware of. Although, of course, we are closely tracking all immigration changes, of which there are many. How much should I budget for a legal consultation for the E-2? So please visit our website. It's also listed on this presentation, and you'll be able to follow the button to schedule a consultation, which will provide all the fees. And if you have questions about those, please feel free to send us an email, and we're happy to make our engagement letters available.
Okay, thank you for all for joining us today. We hope this webinar has been helpful to plan your E-2 visa application. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to visit our website and schedule a consultation with our team. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.